Imagine stepping outside to take a deep breath. But instead of seeing like a puff of white air, the moisture in your breath instantly freezes.
Just immediately turns to ice.
Right. It falls to the snow at your feet with a sound like shattering glass, which is, I mean, that actually happens at minus 50 degrees Celsius.
It's just hard to even conceptualize.
It really is. So today, you and I are going on a deep dive into a stack of notes that asks this incredibly fascinating question. How do you build a human culture in a place that actively wants to eliminate you?
Yeah, and what's so remarkable about these source notes is that they don't just give us this dry geographical survey. They read much more like the blueprints for a massive creative project.
Like a concept album or something.
Exactly, like an album or maybe a graphic novel. Because they map out 4 entirely distinct regions of Russia, but they do it by treating geography as, well, as destiny.
Right.
They mix these really harsh historical facts with lyrical ideas to show us exactly how extreme environments force human resilience, how they shape identity, and ultimately, construct the human soul.
Yeah, and you, the listener, get to follow along as we basically decode this blueprint today. We are entirely skipping the standard textbook summaries and getting straight into the survival tactics, the architectural miracles, and the cultural coping mechanisms.
Because to really understand endurance, you have to start at its absolute limit.
Right, which means we are heading deep into the Sakha Republic, also known as Yakutia, and the frozen expanse of Siberia.
Yeah, this is where we see what the notes call the art of endless winter. If you want to understand how a physical environment forces a culture of survival, Yakutsk is your baseline. I mean, it is the coldest major city on Earth.
It's just wild.
And just outside it is Oyakan, which is known as the Pole of Cold. That's where temperatures regularly hit that minus 50 degrees Celsius mark you mentioned earlier.
I am genuinely trying to wrap my head around that level of cold. Because at minus 50, basic physics just change. Like steel becomes brittle and snaps.
Yeah.
Engine oil turns into like a solid block of jelly. So looking at the indigenous groups living there, the Sakha, the Buryats, the Nenets, how do you even construct a belief system when nature is that violently opposed to your existence?
Well, the notes mention they practice this blend of shamanism and Russian Orthodox beliefs.
Right, but what does that hybrid actually look like on the ground?
It looks like utter pragmatism.
Hmm.
I mean, shamanism in this context isn't just some abstract spirituality. It is a deeply functional relationship with nature.
Like a survival tool.
Exactly. You practice ancestor worship and revered nature spirits because you literally rely on the specific life-saving knowledge your ancestors passed down.
Oh, wow.
They tell you which river bend won't freeze solid or, how to track a reindeer herd through a whiteout blizzard. And when Russian Orthodox missionaries arrived centuries later, the locals didn't just abandon their survival tool.
It just adapted.
Right. They layered the Orthodox saints right on top of their local spirits. So an Orthodox saint might simply become the new patron protector of the reindeer herd. You take what works, and you layer it.
Both spiritually and physically, I guess, because the layering aspect makes perfect sense when you look at their clothing. Function over fashion is an absolute rule here.
Oh, totally.
You have the iconic Ushanka hats with the heavy ear flaps trapping the heat directly against the skull. You have incredibly dense, layered fur clothing. Style is, completely secondary to keeping your blood flowing. But the architecture detailed in these notes, that blew my mind.
The stilts.
Yes. They build their modern concrete structures on stilts, which sounds insane. Like, why elevate a building and let the freezing wind blow underneath your floorboards in the coldest place on Earth?
It's because of the permafrost. The ground there is permanently frozen dirt and ice. If you build a heated structure directly on that ground, the radiant heat from the building slowly melts the ice in the soil directly beneath it.
Oh, right, so it just turns to mud.
Exactly. The foundation loses its structural integrity, and your entire building just sinks into a freezing, muddy sinkhole and collapses. So the stilts isolate the heat of human habitation from the frozen earth.
That is wild.
It really is a perfect physical metaphor for living in Yakutia. You have to maintain this delicate, deliberate separation from the environment just to exist.
And you see that same intense adaptation in their diet, too. The notes highlight stroganina.
Oh, right, the fish.
Yeah, it's raw, frozen river fish, sliced incredibly thin, almost like panes of glass. Because when the ground is frozen solid for most of the year, You aren't growing wheat.
No, definitely not.
You are engineering this high-calorie survival diet out of reindeer meat, foraging, and ice fishing. You're maximizing your caloric intake without wasting precious fuel to cook it.
Exactly. But, there is a profound darkness to this geography, too. Because survival here requires such intense effort, the environment itself becomes a weapon. The notes emphasize Siberia's history as a place of exile. The Russian Empire, and later the Soviet Union with the Gulag labor camps during Stalin's era, utilized this landscape specifically to punish.
Because you literally can't escape.
Right, they sent people there to disappear, using the deadly climate as the ultimate, inescapable prison wall.
Which creates this wild contradiction because the frozen ground they're standing on is just bursting with natural wealth. Oil, gas, gold, diamonds.
Yeah, it's incredibly rich.
It is one of the richest resource pools on the planet, but it's framed in the notes as the ultimate landscape of deprivation.
And that contradiction is exactly what the source notes pull out as the creative thesis for this region. They use the phrase, endure first, reflect later.
Endure first, reflect later.
Yeah. Siberia functions here as a metaphor for profound isolation and survival without comfort. The geography demands that every ounce of your energy goes into simply making it to the next morning.
I want to push back on that, though, or at least test it a bit, because looking at Yakutia feels like looking at a deep space station.
Okay, how so?
Well, it is a society engineered entirely around a vacuum that actively wants to destroy you. If the airlocks fail or the heating stops, you're dead. So if their entire existence is defined by surviving this brutal winter, I don't understand their biggest cultural celebration.
You mean the Yayak Festival?
Yes. It is focused entirely on summer. It is a massive festival of rebirth, drinking fermented mare's milk called kumis, and holding these gigantic communal circle dances. Why is summer their defining cultural moment? Are they celebrating hope, or is it just the exhausted relief that they didn't freeze to death?
I mean, it is the organizing principle of their psychology. When you live in that deep space station, the return of the sun isn't just relief, it is literal proof of life.
Wow, okay.
The physical endurance required creates a stoic survival-first mindset. Those massive circle dances aren't just for fun. They are a physical, visual manifestation of community.
Because you can't do it alone.
Exactly. You cannot survive minus 50 degrees as a lone wolf. The festival is a ritual assertion that collective endurance works. It is a reminder that if we stick together and do exactly what we're supposed to do, summer will eventually come.
Okay, so we have this baseline of stoic, almost desperate survival against nature. But what happens when you take that fundamental Russian resilience and try to mold it into something beautiful? What happens when survival isn't about fighting the cold, but fighting history?
Yeah, St. Petersburg.
A complete 180.
Yeah, the shift here is jarring. We're moving from physical survival in the wilderness to emotional and artistic resilience inside an imperial metropolis. Because to understand St. Petersburg's obsession with beauty and art, you have to realize this city basically shouldn't exist.
Right, it was just a swamp.
Yeah. In 1703, Peter the Great essentially forced his city out of a freezing swamp, just so he could have a cultural capital that looked toward Europe. He wanted classical architecture and elegance where there was literally only mud.
He wanted a window to the west. And the result is this heavy, incredibly complex city. I mean, even the name mirrors its volatile history. It goes from St. Petersburg to Petrograd during World War I to sound less German,
Right.
to Leningrad under the Soviets, and then back to St. Petersburg. It is a city that carries an unimaginable amount of historical trauma. And the notes specifically highlight the siege of Leningrad during World War II, which was, one of the longest and deadliest sieges in human history.
The trauma of that siege completely defines the city's tone in these notes. You go from the pride of imperial neoclassical architecture and canals, the Venice of the North,
Right.
to catastrophic tragedy, and finally to this fierce, battered resilience. But what is crucial to understand is how they survived. It wasn't just calorie counting while people boiled leather belts to make soup. It was artistic defiance.
Okay, I need you to explain that, because the notes list all these artistic giants. Tchaikovsky, Dostoevsky, Pushkin, the Mariinsky Theater Ballet. But it is hard to see how a ballet or a classical symphony helps you survive a military blockade when your city is literally starving to death.
The perfect example of this mechanism is Dmitri Shostakovich.
Okay.
During the siege of Leningrad, the city was surrounded, starving, and freezing. And Shostakovich composed his 7th symphony right in the middle of it.
Wow.
And the starving musicians remaining in the city gathered to perform it. They broadcast it over loudspeakers, not just to the freezing citizens, but outward toward the invading army.
That is incredible.
It was a psychological lifeline. It basically communicated, we are still human, we are still creating beauty, you haven't erased us. The art wasn't just entertainment, it was the actual mechanism of their emotional survival.
So art functions as literal armor. And that actually brings up the musical direction the notes suggest to represent the city, which is fascinating to me. They propose using highly structured classical music for the verses of a song, but gritty, rebellious rock music for the chorus.
Pointing to Soviet rock bands like Kino.
Exactly. It makes me think of St. Petersburg as a teenager wearing a beaten-up leather jacket over a pristine imperial ball gown. It has that classical elegance, but it is deeply rebellious.
And that tension is everywhere in their culture. You have this slow, highly reflective tea-drinking culture paired with borscht and blini, this comforting, melancholic, inward-looking daily routine. But then you have their massive public celebrations, which are just explosive.
Right, like the White Nights Festival, where the sun barely sets in the summer and the whole city stays up in this weird twilight haze. And the Scarlet Sail celebration featuring this massive glowing red ship sailing down the river accompanied by fireworks. But I am kind of struggling to connect the dots here. You have a city defined by unimaginable starvation and historical tragedy. Why is their defining cultural event a glowing red ship sailing down a river while everyone parties in the midnight sun? It feels completely disconnected from their reality.
It only feels disconnected until you realize the tragedy is exactly what fuels the celebration. You do not get the intense, almost desperate appreciation for the White Knights without the darkness of the history that preceded it.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, the bright red ship, the endless summer light, the underground rock music, they are all mechanisms for processing the trauma. St. Petersburg asserts its beauty so aggressively because its history is so dark.
So St. Petersburg handles its trauma by looking outward to Europe, asserting its European identity. But what happens when a region can't look outward? What happens when two entirely different, massive civilizations are trapped looking right at each other, forced to share the same river spine for centuries?
That question leads us away from the coast, following the longest river in Europe, the Volga, straight to the heart of Tatarstan and its capital, Kazan.
Which is a totally different vibe.
The entire focus shifts here. We are no longer talking about surviving nature or surviving a military siege. We are talking about the mechanics of coexistence.
The blending of Slavic and Turkic identity.
Precisely. You have the Tatar influence, which is Turkic and Islamic, blending intimately with the Russian influence, which is Slavic and Orthodox Christian.
Right.
And the ultimate physical symbol of this is the Kazan Kremlin. Inside the walls of this one fortress, you have the Kul Sharif Mosque, this stunning Islamic architecture, standing right side by side with an iconic Orthodox cathedral. They physically share the skyline, creating a constant visual dialogue.
But it wasn't always just a peaceful dialogue, right? I mean, the historical roller coaster here is violent. You start with the early Islamic state of Volga, Bulgaria, then the Mongol Golden Horde sweeps in and leaves its mark, then it becomes the independent Kazan Khanate. And finally, in 1552, Ivan the Terrible violently conquers it and brings it into the Russian Empire. So how do an Islamic state, a Mongol horde, and the Russian Empire physically leave their marks on a single city block without tearing the city apart?
They don't erase each other. They adapt. And the reason they adapt is the Volga River.
Ah, the river.
The river is the economic artery of the entire region. If you destroy the trade hub, you destroy your own wealth.
Yeah.
So out of sheer pragmatism, these massive empires had to figure out how to do business together. Over centuries, that economic pragmatism evolved into a deeply interwoven shared culture.
And you see that interwoven culture in their traditions today, like the Sabantui Spring Plow Festival, which features intense physical competitions like wrestling and horse racing.
Oh, for sure.
And definitely in the food, you have the ekpakmak, which is a hearty triangle meat pie. And their music is this crazy blend traditional Tatar folk singing using a flute called the kore, bleeding right into modern Tatar pop and Russian rock.
The notes offer a specific principled take here. They argue the emotional core of Tatarstan is the constant tension and coexistence of East and West, Islam and Christianity.
Let's anchor this to everyday life for a second. If you, listening right now, have ever had to merge two entirely different corporate cultures, or even just blend two families together under one roof, you know that coexistence isn't just smiling and getting along.
No, definitely not.
It is a daily, active negotiation. It is friction. I feel like their famous dessert, Cheksek, is the perfect analogy for this. It is made of all these distinct individual pieces of fried dough that are bound firmly together by a thick, sticky honey. The honey represents the Volga River, holding all these distinct pieces together.
That's a great way to look at it.
But I have to ask, is this peaceful blending a deliberate, celebrated choice by the people today? Or is it just that lingering survival mechanism? Do they just tolerate each other because they have to share the water?
It is much deeper than passive tolerance. A system of coexistence implies active maintenance. In Kazan, they have been doing that daily negotiation for 500 years.
Wow.
Yes, it started as a necessary survival mechanism. You have to share the river for trade. But the friction eventually sands down the sharp edges. The tension doesn't completely disappear, but it becomes the structural integrity of the region. It becomes a celebrated, distinct Tatar identity.
So the honey becomes the flavor.
Exactly. The honey in your analogy doesn't just hold the pieces together. It becomes the defining flavor of the entire dish.
Okay, so the Volga River binds the interior together with this sticky honey of trade and tolerance. But rivers eventually run out. If you follow the tracks of the Russian Empire from the center all the way across the map to the absolute edge, where the land finally gives way to the Pacific Ocean, you hit our final region,
Vladivostok, the frontier at the edge of the world.
which literally means rule the East.
Yes. It sits in the Primorsky Krai region, wedged right up against the borders of China and North Korea.
And the vibe here is completely different from the rest of the notes. It is the ultimate Wild East. If you picture the American Wild West, but replace the cowboys with sailors and the dusty plains with the Pacific Ocean, you get Vladivostok. It is defined by a hardcore maritime frontier mindset and immense pride in the Russian Pacific Fleet.
And a totally unique biome, too. This is where the freezing Siberian taiga collides with temperate forests.
Right.
It is one of the only places on the planet where you can imagine a massive Amur tiger or an Amur leopard walking silently through deep snow. The environment is wild, but the human history of the city involves extreme restriction.
Hey, because it was founded as a military outpost. And during the Soviet era, it became a completely closed city. Like, foreigners were strictly banned, and even Soviet citizens needed special clearance just to enter because it housed such sensitive naval secrets.
But then the Soviet Union collapses in the 1990s, the gates swing open, and Vladivostok explodes into this hyper-modern Pacific hub.
Just overnight.
Pretty much. Today, you have massive glass structures and the colossal Russky Bridge towering over old Soviet bloc architecture. The diet is extremely reliant on seafood, crab, squid, salmon, and heavily mixed with Korean-influenced pickle dishes because of the sheer geographic proximity to Asia.
Which actually brings me to a huge point of confusion. The notes point out that the musical identity of Vladivostok is this vibrant indie rock infused with ocean ambiance, championed by local legends like the band Moomy Troll.
Right.
But how does a city that was locked down as a paranoid military fortress for decades suddenly develop a cool, outwardly facing indie rock and Asian fusion identity the second the Soviet Union falls? Did the ocean just carry those influences in past the military checkpoints?
That is exactly how the mechanism works.
Yeah.
You can draw lines on a map and officially designate a city as closed, but you fundamentally cannot close the seaport.
Ah, because of the sailors.
Exactly. Sailors travel. Even during the strictest Soviet years, sailors from the Pacific Fleet were going to Japan, to Korea, and to the West. And they were smuggling back cassette tapes, fashion magazines, records, and ideas. The ocean is naturally porous.
So the culture was infiltrating the military base the whole time, right under their noses.
Precisely. While the official surface structure of the city was this rigid military hierarchy, the underground culture was quietly absorbing global maritime influence. The moment the gates opened in the 90s, that indie rock fusion culture didn't just magically appear out of thin air. It had been brewing beneath the surface, sustained by the sailors, waiting for the chance to breathe.
Wow. So what does this all mean for you, the listener? We've traveled through the entirety of these incredibly vivid source notes, and we've seen 4 distinct mechanisms for how geography writes the script for human culture. We started in Siberia, where the brutal -50-degree cold breeds a stoic endurance and a survivalist mindset.
Then we moved to St. Petersburg, seeing how imperial artistic elegance and classical music served as a literal lifeline to process profound historical trauma.
Right.
We traveled down the Volga River, exploring how geography forces a delicate but enduring coexistence of empires and religions in Kazan, and finally Vladivostok, standing as the resilient, porous frontier at the literal edge of the map.
Whether you are prepping for a creative project, trying to understand global markets, or just absolutely love a good story, these notes offer a brilliant framework. They teach us to look at a map not just as a collection of borders, capitals, and exports, but as a blueprint for emotional and psychological metaphors.
And that leaves us with a final provocative thought to consider.
Oh, let's hear it.
Early on, the source material frames Siberia as the ultimate metaphor for isolation and survival without comfort. But when you look at how these regions actually adapt, whether it's holding massive, joyous circle dances on the permafrost in Yakutia or sharing a slow cup of tea in a freezing St. Petersburg winter, you have to ask something.
What's up?
Does extreme punishing geography actually prevent true isolation?
That completely flips the premise.
It does. Perhaps true isolation doesn't come from a harsh climate at all. Perhaps it comes from a lack of shared struggle. The colder the world outside, the closer we are forced to stand together.